I can't believe I wasted my life with you. The words came out even, measured. No shouting, no theatrics. Just the truth. Julia flinched like I'd struck her. Her hands curled into fists on the kitchen counter, knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried again. Evan, just. Don't, I said. Boone shifted at my feet, sensing the tension. His ears twitched, but he stayed still, waiting, same as me. She exhaled hard, looking anywhere but at me. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee, the cheap kind she drank when she stayed up too late. I knew she'd been losing sleep. Guilt does that to a person. I leaned back against the wooden chair, letting the silence sit heavy. I'd found out a week ago. Didn't take long. Some things you just feel in your gut. Julia had started leaving earlier, coming back later. Showered the second she got home. Spent more time on her phone, laughing at nothing, setting it face down when I walked in. Amateur mistakes. I didn't need a private investigator to tell me what I already knew. The final piece had come 2 days ago, when Boone trotted up to me in the yard with something in his mouth. A damn hoodie. Not mine, not hers. Smelled like a bar, sweat, and cologne that wasn't familiar. I didn't need to ask where he found it. Boone was trained to track, same as I was. Julia had gotten sloppy. Now she stood across from me, looking more cornered than defiant. She wasn't stupid, just arrogant. She thought she was good at lying, but I was better at catching them. I'd spent my life tracking movement, reading shifts in behavior. The woods teach you that. Watch long enough, and anything out of place sticks out like a busted fence post. You gonna say anything? I asked. Her jaw tightened. What do you want me to say? I shrugged. Not my problem. Just figured I'd give you a chance to come clean before I go ahead with what I planned. That got a reaction. She swallowed, eyes darting toward the door like she thought she might outrun this. But there was nowhere to run. Not from this. She squared her shoulders. I didn't. Don't lie to me, Julia. Silence. She looked down. That was all the answer I needed. I pushed back from the table and stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet. Boone followed, staying at my heel. Julia didn't move, just stood there, biting her lip like she thought maybe if she stayed still long enough, this would go away. It wouldn't. Evan, she said finally, quieter now. It didn't mean anything. I let out a breath, slow. That's so. I reached for my jacket hanging on the hook by the door. Well, that makes 2 of us. She flinched again, but I was already halfway out the door, Boone right beside me. I didn't slam it shut. Didn't need to. The night air hit sharp, cold. The wind smelled like pine, clean and biting. I walked to the truck, my boots crunching against gravel. Boone hopped into the passenger seat before I even had the door open all the way. He knew the drill. I didn't drive off right away. Just sat there, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the creak of tree branches outside. Julia was inside, probably pacing, probably coming up with some excuse, some way to spin it. I wasn't interested. I reached into the glove box, pulled out the manila envelope I'd put together earlier. Just a collection of facts. Printed bank records, copies of her text messages from the phone bill, a few surveillance photos of her at that rundown bar off the highway. Caleb Campbell, bartender, younger than her by maybe 10 years. Tattoos, scruffy beard. One of those guys who thought laughing too loud made him the center of the room. I'd seen his type 1,000 times. The kind that got real bold around another man's wife. I smirked, tossing the envelope onto the dashboard. He had no idea what was coming. I started the truck. Time to get to work. I pulled out of the driveway slow, gravel grinding under the tires. No rush. Not like Julia was going anywhere. She'd probably sit in the kitchen, chewing on her lip, trying to figure out what just happened. Trying to tell herself I didn't mean what I said. That was her problem. I'd meant every word. Boone shifted in the passenger seat, his nose twitching at the crack in the window. He was used to late-night drives. Most nights, I took the long way home, windows down, letting the cold air keep me awake. Tonight, I wasn't driving to clear my head. I was driving to get things moving. The turnoff for town was empty, just the glow of a single streetlight casting shadows on the pavement. Most folks were asleep by now, but not everyone. I knew exactly where I was headed. I parked outside of Charlie's Tavern, the kind of place that smelled like cheap whiskey and bad decisions. The neon, open, sign flickered like it was barely holding on. Inside, a few regulars nursed their drinks, slumped over the bar, watching some old boxing match on the mounted TV. Nobody looked up when I walked in. The bartender wasn't Caleb. Some kid I didn't know, busy drying a glass that looked like it hadn't been washed right in a while. I took a seat at the bar, tapping a knuckle against the counter. He shuffled over, not exactly eager. "Whiskey? Neat," I said. He nodded, poured it, slid it over without a word. I let the glass sit for a second, watching the door in the mirror behind the bar. Waiting. Didn't take long. Caleb strolled out from the back, laughing at something, towel slung over his shoulder. He didn't see me at first, too busy talking to some girl leaning over the jukebox. He was relaxed, casual, thinking his world was just fine. I let him enjoy that moment. He turned, finally caught sight of me. The easy grin slipped, just a little. He covered it quick, like a man who thought he could bluff his way out of anything. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, grabbing a bottle from the shelf. I knocked back a sip of whiskey, set the glass down slow. "Not here to drink. Just wanted to see the man my wife's been spending so much time with." The room got real quiet. A couple heads turned, interest sparking. The jukebox hummed low in the background, some old country song about hard times and harder women. Caleb blinked. "Look, man. Don't." I kept my voice even, same tone I'd use if I were warning a man not to step on a rattlesnake. "No speeches. No excuses. You knew exactly what you were doing." He exhaled, set the bottle down. "I didn't know she was married." I laughed once, no humor in it. "You're a liar, and a bad one at that." I leaned forward just a little, elbows on the bar. "Let me make this real simple. You and Julia? Done. You see her again, you even think about texting her. I'll know. And you won't like what happens next." He swallowed, looking around like he was hoping someone might step in. No one did. This wasn't the kind of bar where people played hero. "I don't want trouble," he muttered. "Then you should have kept your hands off my wife." His jaw twitched, but he stayed quiet. Smart enough to know better than to push it. I grabbed the glass, finished the whiskey in one smooth pull, and stood. Dropped a 20 on the counter, not for Caleb, but for the bartender who'd have to clean up the tension I left behind. Then I turned and walked out, Boone trotting at my heel. Didn't need to say another word. The point had been made. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air, and let it settle. That was the first step. The warning. Now it was time to finish what I started. I drove home slow, letting the hum of the engine and the cold air through the cracked window settle me. Boone sat up in the passenger seat, I scanning the dark like he was on watch duty. He could probably feel it too, the shift, the tightening of the rope I just started pulling. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The house was dark when I pulled in. Julia hadn't left. Probably thought I'd cool off, come back ready to talk, ready to listen to whatever story she'd come up with. I wasn't interested. I stepped inside, shrugged off my jacket, and tossed the manila envelope onto the coffee table. Julia was curled up in the armchair, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. She glanced at the envelope, then up at me. "What's that?" I took my time answering, unlacing my boots, setting them by the door. "Proof." She inhaled sharply through her nose, fingers gripping the armrest. "You." "Spare me," I said, dropping onto the couch. Already heard every excuse from that idiot at the bar. Her face went pale. "You went to Caleb?" "Yeah. Wanted to see what kind of man was worth wrecking a marriage over." I snorted. Gotta say, not impressed. She sat forward, eyes darting to the envelope again. "Evan, who? Save it." I leaned back, stretching out my legs. I already set things in motion. Accounts are locked. Property stays with me. You get nothing. Her mouth opened, then shut. She looked down at her hands, shoulders curling in. Not angry, not indignant, just small. I could see the gears turning in her head, running through the numbers, the options. She didn't have many. Finally, she spoke, voice quieter. "You want me to leave?" I studied her for a moment. "I don't care where you go, Julia. You're just not staying here." She flinched like I'd hit her. "I have nowhere else." "Not my problem." A long silence stretched between us. The house felt hollow, empty in a way it hadn't before. Maybe it had been for a while, and I'd just been too damn stubborn to see it. She rubbed her temples, shaking her head. "I never wanted it to turn into this." I laughed, low and sharp. "That makes two of us." She stood, ran a hand through her hair. She stopped, swallowed, then nodded to herself. "I'll go in the morning." I didn't say anything, just picked up the envelope and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, flipping it open. I watched as she took in the pictures, the bank statements, the text logs. Proof of her own mistakes, laid out in black and white. "You were always 10 steps ahead," she murmured. "That's why I win." She let out a slow, unsteady breath, then turned and walked down the hall. A minute later, the bedroom door clicked shut. I stayed where I was, listening to the faint creak of the wind against the house, Boone settling at my feet. I reached down, ran a hand over his head. "One down, boy," I muttered. "One more to go." He huffed, stretching out with a grunt. He didn't know what I meant, but it didn't matter. Caleb Campbell still had a debt to pay, and I intended to collect. The next morning, Julia was gone. She hadn't said goodbye, and I hadn't expected her to. A couple of suitcases missing from the closet, the bathroom shelves half empty, that was all the proof I needed. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the space where she used to sleep. It didn't hit me, not like it should have. Maybe because she'd been gone long before she packed her bags. Boone sat at my feet, ears flicking as he watched me. I gave him a pat on the head. "Guess it's just us now, boy." He huffed, like he preferred it that way. I had work to do. I took the truck into town, parked down the street from Charlie's Tavern. It was mid-morning, the bar closed, but that didn't mean Caleb wasn't around. I wasn't stupid enough to go back inside, not after the last conversation we had. Too many eyes. Too many witnesses. Instead, I waited. A half hour later, the side door opened, and Caleb stepped out. He didn't look like a man who'd slept well. His shirt was wrinkled, hair still damp from a rushed shower. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, leaned against the wall, and exhaled slow. I stepped out of the truck and crossed the street. He didn't notice me until I was a few feet away. He startled, dropping the cigarette, crushing it under his boot. "Jesus." I nodded toward the alley beside the bar. "We're gonna have a talk." He hesitated, looking toward the main street like he was considering running. I gave him credit for thinking before he moved. But I wasn't here to throw punches. If I had been, I wouldn't have asked him to step aside first. He finally gave a slow nod and walked into the alley, arms crossed. I followed, keeping my stance loose. No need to threaten. He already knew what I was capable of. He shoved his hands in his pockets. "Look, man. I told you it. Shut up." His mouth snapped shut. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my jacket and held it out. He frowned but took it, unfolding it with wary fingers. His eyes flicked over the words, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "You recognize this?" I asked. He nodded, fingers tightening around the page. "It's my lease." "Yeah. And as of this morning, your landlord got a better offer. He's kicking you out." His head jerked up. "What the hell?" I shrugged. "Money talks." And I made sure he listened. His breath came fast, uneven. "You serious?" "Dead serious. You've got 30 days to find a new place, but I doubt you'll make it that long. Landlord's got some sudden maintenance issues that'll require you to clear out by the end of the week. Bad luck, huh?" He took a step toward me, fist clenched, then seemed to think better of it. Smart. I didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched him. "You can't do this," he muttered. "I already did." He let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to." "Yeah, I do," I interrupted. "You didn't just screw around with my wife. You disrespected me. You laughed behind my back, thought I wouldn't find out. Now you're learning how wrong you were." He swallowed hard, looking away. I gave him a few seconds to process. "You're gonna pack your bags and get the hell out of town," I continued. "Because this is just the start. You stick around, and things will keep getting worse for you. And I won't have to lift a damn finger." His jaw tensed, but the fight was draining out of him. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "I get it," he muttered finally. "No, I don't think you do," I said, stepping closer. "Because if you really understood, you'd already be gone." He nodded, slow, like a man accepting a truth he didn't want to hear. I held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Boone was waiting in the truck, head tilted like he was asking how it went. "All wrapped up," I muttered, starting the engine. "Let's go home." It took less than a week for Caleb to disappear. Word got around fast in a town like this, and by the time Friday rolled around, his bar shift was covered by someone else. Someone said they saw him loading up an old truck with whatever he could fit, driving out before dawn. He left behind a half-packed apartment, an unpaid tab at Charlie's, and a reputation that would follow him wherever he went next. Good riddance. Julia was a different story. She didn't leave town, not right away. Instead, she moved into a small rental on the other side of town, a place that sat between a payday loan office and a gas station that never fixed its flickering sign. It was a step down. A big one. I'd driven past once, not because I was checking up on her, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. The yard was patchy, weeds creeping through cracks in the pavement. The curtain stayed drawn. She wasn't living, she was hiding. That wasn't my problem. My life had already moved on. The business was doing better than ever. The survival training courses had picked up, and I started working more with veterans, guys who wanted to get away from the noise and find their footing again. I spent my mornings tracking through the woods with Boone, my afternoons setting up courses, my nights enjoying the kind of silence a man can only get when he's got nothing dragging him down. I'd taken back control of everything, my land, my time, my focus. I was in town one evening, picking up supplies from the hardware store when I saw her. She was standing in line at the register, arms crossed, a six-pack of beer in her hands. She looked thinner, like she wasn't eating right. Her hair, once always styled just so, was pulled back in a messy bun. She hadn't noticed me yet. I could have walked past. Could have let her pay and leave and disappear back into whatever hole she'd settled into. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed what I needed and stepped into line behind her. It only took a second. She tensed, then turned her head slightly, just enough to see me. She didn't say anything at first. Just stared at the beer in her hands like it might give her the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I remembered. "You didn't have to ruin me." I snorted. "You did that yourself." She flinched, but didn't argue. The cashier rang her up. She paid in cash, stuffing the change into her jacket pocket before finally turning to face me fully. Her eyes looked tired. Not from lack of sleep. From losing. "Are you happy now?" I tilted my head, considering the question. "Yeah, I am." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with all of it. You never thought that far ahead." Her jaw tightened. "I loved you, Evan." "No, you loved what I gave you." I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low, steady. "Now you get to see what life looks like without it." She swallowed hard but didn't argue. She knew I was right. I didn't wait for more. Just stepped around her, paid for my supplies, and walked out into the crisp evening air. Boone was waiting in the truck, watching the door. I set the bag on the seat, gave him a scratch behind the ears. "Nothing to worry about, boy. Just a ghost." He wagged his tail, unconcerned, as I started the engine and pulled out. Julia could live in whatever mess she'd made for herself. I was already miles ahead. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the pines and turning the dirt roads into something quieter, more settled. I welcomed it. Snow had a way of muffling everything, making the world clean again. Boone liked it too, bounding through the drifts like a pup, even though he was getting up there in years. Didn't matter. Some things stayed sharp, no matter how much time passed. The business had never been better. More folks wanted to get out of the city, learn how to track, hunt, survive. I kept the classes small, mostly veterans and a few teenagers looking for direction. The woods taught you things no school ever could: discipline, patience, how to be alone without being lonely. I figured that last one was the most important. Some folks got restless in the quiet. Not me. I thrived in it. One night, just after sundown, I was splitting firewood when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Boone lifted his head from where he was curled by the porch, let out a low chuff, but he didn't get up. Whoever it was, he didn't see them as a threat. I set the axe down, turned toward the driveway. The truck was old, one of those models that used to be red but had faded to something closer to rust. The headlights flicked off. The driver's side door opened. Julia. She stepped out slow, arms wrapped around herself like the cold had caught her off guard. She hesitated before shutting the door, like she was thinking about leaving it open, just in case. Smart. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched her. She took a breath, walked closer. Not all the way, just enough to make it clear she wasn't here by accident. "You're not easy to find," she said. Wasn't trying to be. She nodded like she expected that. "You got a minute?" I glanced at the pile of firewood, then back at her. Not really. She let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over her face. Should have figured. The wind picked up, shaking the bare branches, kicking up the scent of pine and frost. She looked thinner than before, cheeks hollow, dark circles under her eyes. Life hadn't been kind to her since she left, but that was her doing. I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. "What do you want, Julia?" She hesitated, then met my eyes. "Help?" I let that hang between us. She shifted her weight, kicking at a loose rock. "I lost my job. The rent's due. I don't have anywhere to go. And that's my problem now?" She inhaled sharply, like she'd been bracing for a hit and still hadn't seen it coming. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I didn't know where else to go." I watched her for a long moment, considering. She looked smaller now. Not physically, just less. Less of the woman I used to know, less of the one who thought she could play both sides and never pay the price. I didn't hate her, I didn't feel much of anything, really. Just that sense of finality, like when you put down an animal that's been suffering too long. I pushed off the railing, walked inside, and came back a minute later with a wad of cash. Not much. Just enough for a motel, maybe a bus ticket. I held it out. Take it. She blinked, confused. That's it. That's it. She took the money, fingers brushing mine for half a second before she stepped back. You're not even gonna ask what happened? I shook my head. Doesn't matter. She let out a shaky breath, nodded. Guess it doesn't. Boone let out a huff from the porch, settling his head on his paws, watching her like he was waiting for her to leave. She looked down at him, then back at me. Good dog, she said quietly. Always has been. She clutched the money tighter, then turned and walked back to the truck. She didn't look back. I watched her drive off, taillights disappearing down the road, then I went back to splitting firewood. There was work to do. Always was. A few months passed, and winter settled in deep. The kind that made the air sharp and the mornings so quiet you could hear the ice cracking on the lake. I kept busy, clients coming in for survival courses, new land deals keeping my hands full. Life had a rhythm again, one that was mine alone. No noise, no distractions. Just the way I liked it. One evening, I was out by the shed, oiling down my rifle after a long day on the range, when Boone's ears perked. A second later, I heard it too, tires on gravel. Slow. Cautious. I wiped my hands on a rag, stood up, and watched as an unfamiliar truck rolled in, a newer model with out-of-state plates. The driver killed the engine, door creaking open. A man stepped out, early 30s, built like someone who worked with his hands. He took a moment, adjusting to the cold, then met my eyes. You Evan Yates? I nodded. Who's asking? He shut the door, stepped closer. Name's Zane Campbell. My brother was Caleb. I stayed quiet, letting that sit between us. His eyes scanned my face, looking for something. Blame, maybe. Guilt. He wouldn't find either. You ran him out of town, he said finally. I shrugged. Didn't have to run far. He walked out on his own. Zane exhaled hard, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I'm not here to start trouble. Just want to know why. I tilted my head. You got a brother who don't know how to keep his hands off another man's wife. He got a warning. He didn't like what came after. Zane let that sink in. Yeah, sounds like him. I watched him a second longer, then nodded toward the shed. You drive all this way for revenge, or you just needed to hear it from me? He smirked. Caleb ain't worth revenge. He exhaled, looking around at the property, at the house behind me, at Boone, who sat watching like he was sizing up the situation himself. Hell of a place you got here. Earned it. Yeah, I can see that. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind moving through the trees. Then Zane reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out. I didn't take it. It's not what you think, he said. Just some cash he owed. Figured you should have it. I studied him. His hands were steady. No twitch in his jaw. No fidgeting. Just a man tying off a loose end that wasn't even his. I took the envelope, flipped through it. More than I expected. He still owes more, Zane said. I snorted. Figures. Zane shifted, looking at his truck. Anyway, that's it. He gave Boone a nod, then turned back. You ever need anything, you look me up. I run a machine shop down in Boise. I nodded. Appreciate it. He climbed back in his truck, and just like that, he was gone. I stood there a second, listening to the quiet again, then tapped the envelope against my palm before tucking it into my jacket. Inside, I poured myself a drink, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Everything was done now. Julia was gone. Caleb was a ghost. The only thing left was the life I built with my own two hands. Boone curled up by the fireplace, sighing like he knew we were finally at the end of something. I sat back in my chair, boots stretched out, watching the flames flicker. Didn't feel like an ending. Felt like the best damn beginning I'd ever had.